The xenobiology lecture hall at Galactic Central University buzzed with an electric tension that made the very air shimmer with anxiety. Professor Caladrin, S8 tentacles writhed in complex patterns of distress, each sucker releasing nervous pheromones that the atmospheric processors struggled to filter. Today wasn't just another mundane academic session about peaceful species classifications and their gentle evolutionary paths. No, today marked the arrival of their first exchange student from the legendary Deathworld, a planet so impossibly hostile that the Galactic Council had classified it as unsurvivable for any civilized species. The professor's voice trembled as she spoke through the universal translator, the device struggling to mask her barely contained terror. "Class, please. Welcome Jake Williams from Terra." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, causing ripples of fear to cascade through the assembled students, every eye in the massive amphitheater fixed on the sealed entrance doors. 200 alien students from 47 different species held their breath collectively, creating an eerie silence that made the building's life support systems hum louder than usual. The crystalline zephyrons clustered together, their transparent bodies refracting the overhead lights into nervous rainbows. The furry Piptail students had unconsciously formed defensive huddles, their whiskers twitching with primal unease. Even the massive, armored Korthok warriors beings who had conquered 3 solar systems through sheer brutality shifted uncomfortably. In their reinforced seating, the doors hissed open with a mechanical sigh that sounded like the universe itself. Exhaling in dread, Jake Williams stepped inside, and the effect was immediate and terrifying. The human looked impossibly, almost insultingly fragile. No natural armor plating like the Korthok. No defensive spikes protruding from his spine like the Thornback species. No venom sacs visible beneath his skin like the Nexari. No protective crystalline shell like the Zephyrons. He was just ... soft, pink, vulnerable. A walking contradiction to everything the galaxy understood about survival on hostile worlds. Yet something about his confident stride made every predator instinct in the room scream a single, terrifying word: danger. Jake moved with the fluid grace of a creature that had never known the luxury of safety, never experienced the comfort of a world that didn't actively try to kill its inhabitants every single day. His posture spoke of countless unseen battles, of challenges that would break lesser beings, of a species that had somehow clawed its way from the primordial chaos of a death world to the stars themselves. "Hey everyone," Jake said, his voice carrying across the silent amphitheater with casual authority. When he smiled, revealing those bone-white protrusions that his species called teeth, several crystalline zephyrins immediately activated their emergency energy shields. The gesture was meant to be friendly, but every being in the room recognized it for what it truly was: a predator's display of weapons. The universal translator worked overtime, struggling to process not just his words but the underlying threat, patterns embedded in his vocal tones. "Thanks for having me," Jake continued, seemingly oblivious to the terror he was inspiring. "I can't wait to share some stories from back home." A collective shudder ran through the assembled students. From a Class 12 death world, the very concept violated several peace treaties and at least 3 interstellar conventions on mental health preservation. Squeaks. A particularly nervous Piptail student, with fur that had turned completely white from stress, whispered to his neighbor in their native clicking language, "Stories from a Class 12 death world? Are those even legal to tell in civilized space?" Here's where things get interesting, and this is something that still gives xenobiologists nightmares to this. Dead. Jake's enhanced hearing, evolved through millions of years of avoiding things that wanted to eat him, caught the whispered comment from across the room. Human chuckled, a sound that made the room's automated threat detection systems flash amber warnings and begin charging their defensive barriers. "Oh, you'll love them," Jake said, his eyes finding squeaks with predatory precision. The poor Piptail student's fur stood on end as those strange, forward-facing eyes, the eyes of a hunter, locked onto him with casual interest. "Just last summer, my buddy Mike and I went camping in grizzly bear territory. 3 days, just us and whatever we could carry on our backs." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Camping in apex predator territory, voluntarily. For recreation, Professor Caladrin's medical scanner began beeping frantically as half the class's stress levels spiked beyond safe parameters. RATES doubled, breathing became erratic, and several students began exhibiting symptoms of acute anxiety shock. The crystalline Zephyrins' natural luminescence flickered, like dying stars as their energy reserves diverted to emergency protocols. But Jake wasn't finished. He seemed to gain energy from their terror, like some sort of fear-feeding organism. Mike brought his guitar, and we spent the evenings around the campfire playing music. The bears seemed to like it. We had 3 different ones visit our camp over the weekend. Visit, as if apex predators were casual acquaintances stopping by for tea rather than killing machines that could dismantle a human in seconds. The room's emergency medical team activated, preparing for what appeared to be an imminent mass casualty event. Several students had already begun hyperventilating, their species equivalent of panic attacks manifesting in various disturbing ways. The Thornback delegation had unconsciously extended their defensive spikes, creating a forest of razor-sharp protrusions that gleamed under the lecture hall's lights. Professor Caladrin's tentacles coiled, and uncoiled in patterns that her species used to express existential dread. Perhaps this cultural exchange program had been a terrible mistake. Perhaps some doors were meant to remain closed, some knowledge too dangerous to share. Perhaps the Galactic Council had been right to classify certain worlds as forbidden zones. Their inhabitants too alien, too dangerous to integrate into civilized society, but it was too late now. The Deathworlder was here, and his stories were just beginning, as Jake settled into his Sita, specially reinforced chair that could withstand forces that would crush most species. He casually mentioned, "That's nothing compared to what happened." When we ran into the mountain lion family on day 2, the room's life support systems began working overtime as the collective intake of breath from 200 terrified students threatened to create a localized atmospheric disturbance. And Jake Williams, the impossibly fragile-looking human from the Deathworld called Terra, just smiled that predatory smile and prepared to share more tales from hell. If you're fascinated by how small, seemingly insignificant encounters can lead to universe-changing consequences, it's just like compound interest transforms tiny investments into massive fortunes. Be sure to check out our next video about the incredible power of compounding because, just like Jake's stories, the effects build exponentially over time. The next day's survival biology seminar began innocently enough, with Professor Zethkar discussing the basic principles of species preservation and environmental adaptation. The lecture hall's atmospheric processors hummed quietly in the background, maintaining perfect conditions for the diverse array of students who had gathered to learn about the gentle art of staying alive in civilized space. But everything changed. When Jake Williams raised his hand and casually mentioned his weekend hobbies, the room's environmental systems immediately began struggling to process the collective fear pheromones being released. It was like watching a controlled demolition of sanity, one terrifying revelation at a time. The automated air filtration units kicked into overdrive, their mechanical worry growing louder, as they attempted to clear the rapidly thickening atmosphere of panic-induced chemical releases. Wait, interrupted Verasin. A delicate plant-based Florian, whose normally vibrant green leaves were now trembling like autumn foliage in a hurricane. Her photosynthetic patches flickered with distress signals that any botanist would recognize as severe trauma responses. "You said you voluntarily entered territories occupied by apex predators?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. Every student in the amphitheater leaned forward, their various sensory organs straining to process what they were about to hear. The crystalline Zephyrons dimmed their natural luminescence to barely visible levels, as if trying to hide from the knowledge that was coming. Jake nodded enthusiastically, his human expression of joy somehow more terrifying than any snarl or threat display they had ever witnessed. "Oh yeah, all the time. Bears, mountain lions, wolves there, everywhere in the wilderness back home. My sister Emma and I used to go backpacking in Yellowstone every summer. That's where the really big predators live. Now here's where it gets truly insane, and this is something that still keeps xenobiologists awake at night." Jake wasn't boasting or trying to impress anyone. He was simply sharing what his species considered normal recreational activities. The casual tone in his voice suggested that walking into apex predator territory was as routine as checking the weather forecast. He activated his portable holographic projector with practiced ease, and the three-dimensional image that materialized in the center of the room sent shockwaves of pure terror through the assembled students. The projection showed a massive brown bear, its fur rippling with barely contained power. Standing on its hind legs to reach a height that dwarfed even the largest Korthok warriors. But it wasn't the size that made everyone's blood run cold. Was the details. Those claws. Sweet, merciful cosmos. Those claws were longer than most students' entire bodies. Each one a curved instrument of death that could tear through titanium plating like tissue paper. The bear's teeth gleamed in the holographic light. Each canine, the size of a small dagger, evolved specifically for crushing bones and ending lives with surgical precision. This guy wandered into our campsite around midnight, Jake continued, seemingly oblivious to the terror spreading through the room like a plague. His voice carried the same casual tone someone might use to describe a neighbor dropping by for coffee. Just sniffing around for food, you know how it is? Emma was so excited she tried to take pictures. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that occurs when an entire group of sentient beings simultaneously realizes they are in the presence of something so fundamentally alien that their brains struggle to process the information. The Etherean student Lumiara's crystalline form began resonating with pure panic, her internal harmonic frequencies creating a sound like breaking glass that made everyone's teeth ache. You photographed the apex predator instead of fleeing? Lumiara managed to whisper, her voice crackling with disbelief and horror. Jake looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would find this strange. Well, running would have been stupid, he explained matter-of-factly, his tone suggesting that this was basic survival knowledge that any civilized being should possess. Bears can run 60 kilometers per hour. Trying to outrun one would be like trying to outrun a military assault vehicle. The room's emergency medical systems began activating as stress-induced symptoms manifested throughout the student body. Heart rates spiked beyond safe parameters, breathing became erratic, and several species began exhibiting their equivalent of panic attacks. The Thornback delegation unconsciously extended their defensive spikes, creating a forest of razor-sharp protrusions that gleamed menacingly under the lecture hall's lights. But Jake wasn't finished painting this picture of impossible survival. We just stayed calm, made ourselves look big, and backed away slowly. The bear got bored and left after about 10 minutes. Then we roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories until dawn. Think about this for a moment. While facing down a creature that could dismantle them in seconds, these humans had remained calm enough to execute a strategic retreat. But more than that, they had then continued their recreational activities as if nothing had happened. They had roasted marshmallows. They had told stories. They had treated an encounter with certain death as merely an interesting interruption to their vacation. 3 students had already collapsed from shock, their nervous systems unable to process the cognitive dissonance of what they were hearing. The emergency medical team was on standby, their equipment beeping frantically as they prepared for what appeared to be an imminent mass casualty event. The Piptel student's squeaks, whose fur had turned completely white from stress over the past 2 days, raised a trembling paw, but ... But how did you know the predator would leave? What if it had decided to consume you? Jake's response would later be studied by xenopsychologists as a perfect example of Deathworld mentality. We didn't know for sure, he admitted with a shrug that somehow conveyed both nonchalance and lethal competence. But Emma had bear spray, and I had my knife. If things went bad, we would have made it expensive for him. Made it expensive. As if facing down a creature that weighed 4 times their combined mass was simply a matter of cost-benefit analysis. As if these fragile-looking humans possessed some hidden arsenal of destruction that could threaten an apex predator, the rooms. Life support systems began working overtime as the collective intake of breath from 200 terrified students threatened to create a localized atmospheric disturbance. Professor Zethkar's tentacles had coiled into defensive knots, position his species adopted only when facing extinction-level threats. There's more, Jake said cheerfully, pulling up another holographic image. This one's from when we encountered the wolf pack on day 3. The projection showed a group of lean, predatory shapes with glowing eyes and bared fangs, surrounding what appeared to be a small human shelter. The image froze there, creating perhaps the most effective cliffhanger in the history of interspecies communication. And that's when the real terror began to set in. If these were just Jake's casual weekend activities, what kind of nightmares did his species consider serious challenges? Just like compound interest, we're small. Consistent actions build into massive results over time. Jake's seemingly simple stories were compounding into something that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. Don't miss our next video about the incredible power of compounding, because sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest steps. Professor Kethmer's atmospheric sciences lecture had been proceeding smoothly until that fateful moment when Jake Williams raised his hand. The distinguished professor, the species had evolved on a world where the most extreme weather event was a light drizzle, had been confidently explaining the classification system for dangerous atmospheric phenomena. His forearms gestured elegantly as he displayed holographic models of various storm systems, each labeled with their respective danger ratings according to the Galactic Weather Safety Council. As you can see, Professor Kethmer was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent centuries studying atmospheric disturbances from the safety of climate-controlled laboratories. Class 7 storm systems represent the absolute upper limit of survivable weather events. Winds exceeding 150 kilometers per hour, with localized pressure drops that can cause structural damage to properly reinforced buildings. The assembled students nodded respectfully, their various sensory organs processing this information with the appropriate level of academic concern. The crystalline zephyrins dimmed their natural luminescence in a display of respectful attention, while the furry Piptail students took careful notes with their delicate paws. Then Jake raised his hand, and the universe tilted on its axis. "You mentioned Class 7 storm systems," Jake said, his voice carrying that now familiar casual tone that made everyone's survival instincts scream warnings. "On Terra, we have something called hurricanes that might be similar, except there. Clashy events and people sometimes refuse to evacuate during them." The professor's translator malfunctioned briefly, circuits overloading as they attempted to process the concept of voluntary exposure to planetary-scale disasters. The device emitted a series of electronic squeaks and whistles before finally managing to convey the impossible words to the assembled students. Class 11 weather events. The scale didn't even go that high in civilized space. The Galactic Weather Safety Council had established Class X as the theoretical maximum, the point at which atmospheric disturbances became so violent that they could literally tear apart the molecular bonds holding matter together. And this human was casually suggesting that his species regularly experienced events that exceeded even that impossible threshold. "My neighbor Tom throws hurricane parties," Jake continued, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was systematically destroying every student's understanding of physics, meteorology, and basic survival instincts. "When the government tells everyone to evacuate because winds are hitting 250 kilometers per hour, some people stock up on supplies and ride it out." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Hurricane parties. They were celebrating weather events that could level entire cities. The concept was so alien, so fundamentally wrong, that several students' neural pathways began misfiring as they attempted to process the information. But Jake wasn't finished painting this picture of impossible survival. His eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm as he recalled the memory, like someone fondly remembering a pleasant family gathering rather than a brush with planetary annihilation. "I remember Hurricane Patricia," Jake said, his voice taking on the warm tone of nostalgia. "The storm was so massive it covered half the continent. Trees flying through the air like missiles, buildings collapsing left and right, flooding everywhere you looked. The emergency broadcasts were telling people it was a once-in-a-lifetime event that would reshape the coastline permanently. The room's atmospheric processors began working overtime as the collective terror of 200 students created a chemical soup of panic pheromones. The Thornback delegation unconsciously extended their defensive spikes, creating a forest of razor-sharp protrusions that gleamed menacingly under the lecture hall's lights." "And what did Tom do?" Jake asked rhetorically, his grin widening in a way that made everyone's predator detection systems flash critical warnings. I fired up his grill in the garage and invited half the neighborhood. We spent 3 days eating, barbecue, playing cards, and listening to the storm try to tear his house apart. The Zephyrian student Aristelle, whose homeworld experienced only gentle breezes that barely rustled the crystalline flowers in their gardens, began hyperventilating. Through her gill slits, her species had evolved in an environment so peaceful that their word for storm was the same as their word for gentle massage. U. Celebrate apocalyptic weather events. She managed to whisper, her voice crackling with disbelief. Jake paused, considering the question with the same thoughtful expression someone might use when deciding what to have for lunch. It's not celebrating exactly, he clarified, his tone suggesting that this was an important distinction. More like, we refuse to let them control us. When nature throws everything it has at you, you can either cower in fear, or you can show it that humans don't break easily. Here's where it gets truly insane, and this is something that still keeps atmospheric scientists awake at night. Jake wasn't describing some rare extreme behavior exhibited by a few crazy individuals. He was talking about a cultural norm, a fundamental aspect of how his entire species approached existential threats. Oh, and then there's tornado season, Jake added casually, as if discussing a pleasant hobby. My cousin Dan actually chases tornadoes for a living, drives armored vehicles directly into the storm systems to study them. The professors for arms began trembling uncontrollably as his species' equivalent of a panic attack manifested. In physical symptoms, the concept of voluntarily pursuing atmospheric disasters was so alien that his academic mind struggled to maintain coherent thought. Patterns Jake activated his portable holographic projector, and the three-dimensional image that materialized in the center of the room sent shockwaves of pure terror through the assembled students. The projection showed a massive tornado tearing across the landscape, a spinning column of destruction that reached from the ground to the clouds. Its funnel cloud dark with debris and raw concentrated violence. But what made everyone's blood run cold wasn't the tornado itself, it was the small, seemingly fragile vehicle pursuing it at high speed, chasing the very embodiment of atmospheric chaos like a predator stalking its prey. Dan's been doing this for 15 years, Jake added, casually, his voice carrying the pride of someone discussing a family member's successful career. He's been inside 17 tornadoes and lived to tell about it. Says the eye of the storm is actually pretty calm once you get past the part where everything's trying to kill you. The room's emergency protocols activated as 2 more students collapsed from shock, their nervous systems unable to process the cognitive dissonance of what they were hearing. The emergency medical team rushed to provide assistance, their equipment beeping frantically as they administered sedatives and anti-anxiety medications. Think about this for a moment. While most civilized species would consider a Class 7 storm system to be a civilization-ending catastrophe requiring immediate evacuation to orbital stations, these humans were not only surviving Class G events but actually seeking them out for recreational purposes. They had turned atmospheric warfare into a form of entertainment. The Piptel student Squeaks, whose fur had turned completely white from stress over the past few days, raised a trembling paw. But how many of your people die in these weather events? Jake's response would later be studied by xenopsychologists as a perfect example of Deathworld mentality. Well, some do, he admitted with a shrug that somehow conveyed both acceptance and defiance. But that's the price of living free. We'd rather face the storm on our own terms than spend our lives hiding from it. The room's life support systems began working overtime as the collective intake of breath from 200 terrified students threatened to create a localized atmospheric disturbance. Professor Kethmer's tentacles had coiled into defensive knots, a position his species adopted only when facing extinctional-level threats. There's more, Jake said cheerfully, pulling up another holographic image. This one's from when my uncle decided to surf during Hurricane Alina. The projection showed a human figure balanced impossibly on a board, riding waves that towered higher than most buildings while the sky raged with the fury of a dying star. The image froze there, creating perhaps the most effective cliffhanger in the history of interspecies communication, And that's when the real terror began to set in. These were just Jake's casual observations about weather. What kind of nightmares? Did his species consider serious natural disasters? It's just like compound interest, where small, consistent actions build into massive results over time. Jake's seemingly simple weather stories were compounding into something that would forever change. How the galaxy understood the relationship between sentient life and hostile environments. Don't miss our next video about the incredible power of compounding, because sometimes the most profound transformations start with the smallest acts of defiance. During the cultural exchange presentation, the atmosphere in the Grand Amphitheater was already thick with tension from Jake's previous revelations about Terran survival practices. The assembled delegates from 47 different species had gathered to witness what they believed would be an educational discussion about childhood, development across different worlds. Instead, they were about to experience what would later be classified as a diplomatic incident requiring extensive trauma counseling for all attendees. Professor Caladrin, her tentacles still trembling from the previous day's weather discussion, approached the podium with visible reluctance. The universal translator hummed nervously, its circuits already strained from processing concepts that challenged the very foundations of civilized behavior. "Jake," she began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone diffusing an explosive device. "Perhaps you could share with us some typical childhood activities from your homeworld. Something peaceful and educational that might help us understand how young Terrans develop their remarkable resilience." The request seemed innocent enough. After all, what could be dangerous about children's games? The assembled delegates leaned forward with genuine curiosity, their various sensory organs focusing on Jake as he stood at the center of the amphitheater. The crystalline zephyrons brightened their natural luminescence in anticipation, while the furry Piptel students prepared to take notes about what they assumed would be gentle, recreational activities. Jake's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. The same expression a grandfather might wear when asked to share fond memories of simpler times. Let's see. We played tag, hide and seek, and something called Red Rover, where you'd try to break through a chain of other kids using pure momentum and determination. The words seemed innocent enough at first, but something about Jake's casual delivery made the room's threat detection systems begin flickering with amber warnings. The audience shifted uncomfortably as Jake continued, seemingly unaware of the rising panic that was beginning to permeate the carefully controlled atmosphere. "Oh, and we had playgrounds with these metal structures called jungle gyms," Jake continued, his voice taking on the warm tone of nostalgia. "Basically climbing frameworks suspended for meters off the ground. No safety nets, just wood chips underneath to cushion the fall when you inevitably slipped." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that occurs when an entire group of highly intelligent beings simultaneously realizes they are witnessing something that violates every principle of child safety and species preservation they have ever known. The Etherian student, Lumiara's crystalline form, began resonating with distress frequencies that made everyone's inner ear canals ache with sympathetic vibrations. "Children ... fell from these structures?" Lumiara managed to whisper her voice, crackling with disbelief and horror. Here's where it gets truly insane, and this is something that still keeps child development specialists across the galaxy awake at night. Jake didn't just confirm that children fell from these death traps. He celebrated it, all the time. Jake laughed, the sound making several students flinch as if struck by a physical blow. "I broke my arm twice before I was 10. I was falling off my bike, going down a hill. Once from a tree I was climbing. Speaking of trees, we'd climb them for fun, sometimes 20 meters high, just to see how far we could go before the branches got too thin to support our weight." The room's emergency medical systems began activating as stress-induced symptoms manifested throughout the student body. Heart rate spiked beyond safe parameters, breathing became erratic, and several species began exhibiting their equivalent of panic attacks. The Thornback delegation unconsciously extended their defensive spikes, creating a forest of razor-sharp protrusions that gleamed menacingly under the lecture hall's lights. But Jake wasn't finished painting this picture of systematic child endangerment. His eyes grew distant with fond memories as he continued to describe. what his species apparently considered normal childhood development. And in winter, we'd go sledding down mountains at dangerous speeds with no protection except hoping we'd stop before hitting a tree. Jake continued, his voice carrying the same warmth someone might use to describe a beloved family tradition. My sister Emma once went so fast down Devil's Hill that she launched clear over the creek at the bottom. Landed in a snowbank about 30 meters away. She was laughing so hard she couldn't stand up for 10 minutes, the Wispenian delegate. A distinguished academic whose species had evolved on a world where the most dangerous childhood activity was collecting flower petals, stood up abruptly. His normally pristine fur was standing on end, creating an impressive display of pure outrage and terror. "Professor, I must protest this cultural contamination," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed enough. Atrocities for one lifetime. Terran is describing systematic child endangerment. This is not education, this is a catalog of species-level negligence. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire cultural exchange program might collapse under the weight of moral outrage. But Jake's response was even more terrifying than his descriptions of childhood trauma. He looked genuinely confused, his expression carrying the innocent bewilderment of someone who couldn't understand why anyone would find his stories disturbing. But, it was fun, he said, his tone suggesting that this should be obvious to anyone with basic intelligence. We turned everything into a game. It's how kids learn, by pushing boundaries and discovering what they're capable of. Think about this for a moment. While most civilized species carefully protected their young from any potential harm, creating sterile environments where children could develop safely, these humans were deliberately exposing their offspring to mortal danger. As part of their normal educational process, even our sports involved controlled violence, Jake continued, his voice taking on the pride of someone discussing a cherished cultural tradition. Football, hockey, boxing, mixed martial arts tournaments. My brother Ryan started wrestling when he was 6. The room's universal translator began overheating as it attempted to process the concept of recreational combat among juveniles. Steam began rising from the device's cooling vents as its circuits strained to comprehend how any species could consider physical violence to be an appropriate childhood activity. "Wrestling?" squeaked the Piptel student named Squeaks, whose fur had turned completely white from stress over the past few days. "You mean ... actual combat? Between children?" Jake nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the horror in the question. "Oh yeah, it's great for building character and physical fitness. Ryan won 3 state championships before he turned 12. Coach always said the best way to toughen up kids was to let them figure out how to handle themselves when things got rough." The room's life support systems began working overtime as the collective intake of breath from 200 terrified students threatened to create a localized atmospheric disturbance. Professor Caladrin's tentacles had coiled into defensive knots, a position her species adopted only when facing extinction-level threats. "There's more," Jake said cheerfully, pulling up a holographic image of what appeared to be a human child suspended high above the ground on some sort of rope contraption. "This is from when I learned to rock climb. I was about 8 when Dad took me up my first cliff face." The projection showed a small figure dangling from a vertical rock wall, held only by thin ropes and metal implements that looked utterly inadequate for preventing a fatal fall. The image froze there, creating perhaps the most effective cliffhanger in the history of interspecies communication. And that's when the real terror began to set in. If these were just Jake's casual memories of childhood recreation, what kind of nightmares had shaped his species into the apex survivors they had become? Just like compound interest, we're small. Consistent investments build into massive wealth over time. Jake's seemingly innocent childhood experiences were compounding into something that would forever change how the galaxy understood the relationship between risk, growth, and human potential. Don't miss our next video about the incredible power of compounding, because sometimes the most profound transformations start with the smallest acts of courage. On the final day of his presentation, the atmosphere in the grand amphitheater was electric with anticipation and barely contained terror. Word had spread throughout the university and beyond about the human exchange student, who had single-handedly challenged every assumption about survival, childhood development, and the fundamental nature of intelligent life itself. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with representatives from 47 different species cramming into every available space, including the emergency overflow areas that had never been used before in the university's 1,000-year history. This wasn't just another academic presentation. This was the moment when the galaxy's greatest minds would finally get the answer to the question that had been keeping xenobiologists, philosophers, and military strategists awake at night for the past week. How did the inhabitants of a Class 12 Deathworld not only survive, but somehow conquer the stars? The assembled delegates represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. There were the Etherian collectives, top scientists, whose crystalline forms pulsed with nervous energy. The Korthak Empire had sent their finest military analysts, massive, armored beings who had conquered entire star systems through sheer brutality, yet now sat in respectful silence. Even the enigmatic void dancers had materialized from their dimensional pockets to witness what many were calling the most significant anthropological moment in galactic history. Professor Caladrin approached the podium with the careful precision of someone diffusing a temporal bomb, or tentacles, which had been in a constant state of agitation for the past week, now moved with the deliberate control of someone who understood that the next few minutes would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. Jake, she began, her voice carrying across the amphitheater with the weight of historical significance. You've shared with us remarkable stories about your people's relationship with danger, whether in what we would consider impossible survival scenarios. But there's one question that has been troubling all of us. The room fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems working overtime to process the collective anxiety of nearly 1,000 sentient beings. Jake stood at the center of the amphitheater, no longer the casual, friendly exchange student who had wandered into their lives a week ago. Something had changed in his posture, in the way he carried himself, as if the weight of representing his entire species had finally settled on his shoulders. How did your species survive to achieve spaceflight? Professor Caladrin asked, her voice barely above a whisper yet somehow carrying to every corner of the massive hall. The question hung in the air like a challenge to the very foundations of evolutionary biology. Every species in the galaxy had followed the same basic pattern: develop intelligence, create safe environments, build civilization, reach for the stars. But humans had somehow bypassed the crucial step of creating safety, instead choosing to embrace danger as a fundamental aspect of their existence. Jake paused, his expression growing serious for the first time since he had arrived at the university. The casual smile that had terrorized students for the past weeks slowly faded, replaced by something that made every predator instinct in the room recognize an apex species in its natural element. This wasn't the friendly college student sharing amusing anecdotes about his homeworld. This was a human being, a product of 4 billion years of evolution's most brutal testing ground, preparing to explain how his people had achieved the impossible. I think, Jake said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made the air itself seem heavier. It's because we never saw Terra as a death world. We saw it as home. The words hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow.
Ow.
Here was the fundamental difference that had eluded their greatest minds. While every other species had evolved to escape their environment's challenges, humans had evolved to embrace them. Every challenge, the predators, the weather, the natural disasters, they weren't obstacles to overcome. Jake continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. They were teachers. It's the best teachers in the universe, because they never let you forget that failure means death. He gestured to his classmates, and for the first time, they saw something in his eyes that made them understand why humans had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. It wasn't just intelligence or technology or even their seemingly suicidal courage. It was something deeper, something that had been forged in the crucible of a world that tested every moment of existence. You've all evolved on worlds that supported life, Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. We evolved on a world that tested it. Every day, in every way. Our hurricanes taught us to prepare and adapt. Our predators taught us to be aware and respect our environment. Our dangerous games taught us to take calculated risks and push our limits. The room was silent except for the hum of life support systems struggling to process the collective awe and terror. This was the moment when the galaxy's understanding of evolution itself began to shift. They had always assumed that intelligence was about avoiding challenges, about creating safe spaces where civilization could flourish. But humans had taken the opposite path, using intelligence to engage with danger more effectively.
Oh, we don't.
Seek danger because we're reckless, Jake continued, his voice carrying the authority of a species that had clawed its way to the stars through sheer determination. We seek it because it's how we grow. Every human child who climbs a tree, survives a storm, or faces down a challenge, learns something that no peaceful world can teach. That survival isn't about avoiding death, it's about making life worth living. Think about this for a moment. While every other species had spent their evolutionary history trying to minimize risk, humans had spent theirs learning to manage it. They had turned danger into a tool for growth, fear into fuel for courage, and uncertainty into the raw material of adventure. Professor Caladrin's voice was barely a whisper when she asked the question that everyone was thinking. And that's why you're not afraid. Jake smiled that predatory smile one last time, and every being in the room understood. They were looking at the product of 4 billion years of evolution's most brutal testing ground. But his answer would shatter their assumptions once again. Terrified, Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with fear itself. Every single day? But we've learned that fear isn't the opposite of courage, it's the fuel that powers it. And we've been burning that fuel for so long that we've forgotten it's not normal to everyone else. The revelation rippled through the assembled delegates like a shockwave. Humans weren't fearless. They were afraid of everything, just like every other species. The difference was that they had learned to use fear as a tool rather than letting it control them. When we look at a hurricane, we don't see destruction, Jake continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. We see a challenge to overcome. When we encounter a predator, we don't see death. We see a teacher showing us how to be better. When our children fall from playground equipment, we don't see failure. We see the first step toward resilience. The room's life support systems began working overtime as the collective intake of breath from nearly 1,000 terrified yet fascinated students threatened to create a localized atmospheric disturbance. This was more than just a cultural exchange. This was the moment when the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be truly alive began to transform. As the semester ended, something remarkable happened. Applications for the Terran exchange program mysteriously increased by 300%. Most were rejected for psychological incompatibility, their minds unable to process the concept of voluntary danger as a pathway to growth. But a few brave souls began preparing for the ultimate test. A semester on the Deathworld called Earth. The universe would never be the same. Because Jake Williams had shown them that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from avoiding challenges, but from embracing them completely. Just like compound interest, where small, consistent actions build into massive results over time. Jake's simple truth about human nature was compounding into something that would reshape galactic civilization itself. Don't miss our next video about the incredible power of compounding, because sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest acts of courage.